Welcome to episode 4 of FCLE Seminar, the Florida Civic Literacy Exam Podcast. I'm your host, Mercedes Musto. Today, we're getting into one of the most controversial and impactful Supreme Court cases in American history, Dred Scott versus Sanford. This case sent shockwaves through the nation and brought the issue of slavery to a boiling point. So let's break it down, the facts of this landmark case to help you prepare for the FCLE. This is all based on the guide put together by the Florida Department of Education. I've got the links to that study stuff in the show notes, so check those out. And don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe to our podcast at FCLE Seminar on YouTube. Got it? Good. Okay, let's get started. Landmark Supreme Court case number 3, Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1856. Case background. First, let's describe the era. It's 1856. Now, to put this on a timeline, this case is happening before the American Civil War, which occurred between 1861 and 1865. Okay. Case background. First, let's describe the era. It's 1856. Now, to put this on the timeline, this case is happening before the American Civil War, which occurred between 1861 and 1865. Now to the case background. Let me give it to you straight. Dred Scott was a slave who lived in Missouri. But here's the twist. From 1833 to 1843, he also lived in some other states like Illinois, a free state, and the Louisiana Territory, where slavery was banned because of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Well, more on that later. So check this out. When Dred Scott returned to Missouri, he sued for his freedom, arguing that living in free territories made him a free man. Now, this case went on for years, and it got really complicated. And Dred Scott, in the end, lost his case in the Missouri courts. But then his case reached the Supreme Court, where the justices had to answer a seemingly simple question. Was Dred Scott free, or was he to remain a slave? Now, remember, we are all in pre-American Civil War, and major national tensions were building in the North and the South. The court's decision. Sadly, this is one of the Supreme Court's most infamous cases. Infamous means bad famous. Ouch, right? In a 7-2 decision, the court ruled in favor of the slave owner John F.A. Sanford, as in Dred Scott versus Sanford. Sanford was Dred Scott's slave owner. Now, Sanford declared that no African slaves or even descendants of African slaves would be or even could be American citizens. And therefore, there was no standing. They had no standing in federal court, meaning that Dred Scott could not sue or seek the protection of the federal courts. Okay. Now, there is further explanation of this decision regarding the constitutional principle interpreted at that time. I do encourage you to look into this case and all its complexities at oyez.com or britannica.com, something like that. Now, the constitutional principle here. First, let's discuss the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which is approximately 30 plus years before the Dred Scott case of 1856. The Missouri Compromise was a law passed by Congress in an attempt to balance the growing sectional tensions between the North and the South over the national issue of slavery in the new states. So Missouri was admitted as a slave state, and Maine was admitted as a free state. This is the compromise because, the primary goal was to maintain a balance of power between slave and free states in the U.S. Senate. And that's because the nation, as the nation was expanding westward, the issue of slavery in new territories became increasingly contentious. Thus, the Missouri Compromise was it seemed like a temporary solution to this problem. Back to the primary constitutional principle at the issue of Dred Scott versus Sanford case, and that is the property clause of the Fifth Amendment What? According to oyez.com, the majority opinion led by Roger B. Taney and the court ruled that, quote, held portions of the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional in violation of the Fifth Amendment, treating Scott as property, not as a person, quote. Ooh, interpretation. Enslaved people were not citizens at that time or perceived so. In fact, they were considered property. And the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process prevented the federal government from depriving property owners, in this case slave holders, of their property without due process of law. Ooh. There was intense opposition to the court's decision based on the claim's substance and the court's lack of jurisdiction. Ultimately, Benjamin Robbins Curtis and John McLean argued in favor of American citizenship for men of African descent, stating that not only could men of African descent become American citizens, but that they were also granted the right to vote in 5 states. Listen, I appreciate you listening today, taking to heart to understand one of our nation's historical Supreme Court cases. Let's review. Dred Scott's claim. As a Missouri slave, Dred Scott sued for his freedom after residing in a free territory. The Supreme Court's ruling of the Dred Scott v. Sanford 1856 was this. The Supreme Court ruled people of African descent, enslaved or free, were not considered citizens and therefore lacked the right to sue in federal court. They also ruled that the Missouri Compromise, which prohibited slavery in certain territories, was unconstitutional, and that at that time, slaves were considered property, and the government could not deprive owners of their property. Now, this is important. Dissenting opinions. Justices Curtis and McLean criticized the majority for addressing the merits of the case when they should have dismissed it on jurisdictional grounds. Okay, but more importantly, they argued that people of African descent could be citizens and that the majority's decision was deeply flawed. Final words. According to Britannica.com, Dred Scott did eventually gain his freedom. However, it was not a legal victory, but rather an act of kindness. After being bought back by the Blow family, the original owners who had sold him to Emerson, Dred Scott and his wife, Harriet, were granted freedom in 1857. Tragically, though, Dred Scott died of tuberculosis the following year, but his wife, Harriet, not only lived through the Civil War, but also lived to witness the end of slavery with the passage of the 13th Amendment. Join us again on FCLE Seminar, a Florida Civic Literacy podcast, so you can start studying for your test. The important thing is to start studying and start studying today. Well, what are you waiting for? Like, subscribe, and leave your questions or comments for us at FCL Seminar on YouTube, or hit me up on Spotify, Apple, or any of your favorite podcast players. This podcast was recorded at the Pickens Multimedia Studio at the University of West Florida. This podcast is listener-supported. Contributions can be made via the listener support link on Spotify, or you can buy me a coffee via the show link notes. This is your host, Mercedes Musto. Join me again on FCLE Seminar, a Florida Civic Literacy Exam podcast, so you can pass the FCLE.